Welcome back. In this video, I want to run through the entire syllabus of this course. We're not going to talk about things in much detail, but I do want to introduce you to everything we're going to talk about. And there's quite a bit, as you can see. This is a very long course, lots of material, very comprehensive. To start off, we do our course basics, which is where you are right now. It's definitely the least substantial unit in this entire course. It just covers things about the syllabus and how the course works and gives you some advice. And then we really get going with Introduction to Front-End. So we talk about what front-end development is, what back-end development is, how they're different, what HTML is, what CSS is, what JavaScript is. But you still don't write a whole lot of code until this unit when we actually talk about HTML. So there are two units on HTML, Introduction and Intermediate HTML. And then once you finish that, we move on to CSS, which is how we can make things look nice. We add some style in. So that's where the projects start to get a little more exciting. Have you make an image gallery for a photography portfolio site, and we also have you make a blog site. So 2 units on CSS, Intro and Advanced. We talk about things like typography, fonts, including custom fonts, using Google Fonts, forms, validations, lots of topics. Then we talk about Bootstrap, which is a CSS and JavaScript framework that helps you make nice looking websites really quickly and easily. And in that unit, we make a few projects, including a portfolio site and a startup landing page, or a home page for a startup. Then we hit JavaScript, and that's where things, in my opinion at least, start to get really interesting and exciting. We start talking about our first real programming language, JavaScript. So we start with the basics, and there's a lot to talk about with JavaScript, so you can see pretty much takes up from here down to the end. Everything involves JavaScript, and to be fair, everything involves HTML and CSS as well, but JavaScript becomes the focus. That's how we start making robust web applications, not just simple websites. And I'll expand on that difference in the next unit. But let's keep moving. So JavaScript basics, then we talk about something called control flow, which is how we add basic logic into our applications with JavaScript. And then something called functions, JavaScript arrays and objects, 2 different data structures. And then we move on to my favorite topic, which is DOM manipulation, which is how we actually interact with HTML and CSS using JavaScript. So to some of you, that might just be a bunch of random words you've never heard in your life, or that you can't really make sense of. Basically, it's how we start making things exciting. When I click on a page, something happens. We can start changing colors, animating things, moving things across the screen. It's very visual and fun. Then we have another unit on DOM events, which is some other DOM manipulation that we can focus on. And then we have a color game project, which is a substantial, pretty complex game that we make together. It's an entire unit. It's 8 or 9 videos creating this game. So it's a pretty legit project. And then we move on to a really popular library called jQuery, and we focus on that for 3 units. Introduction to jQuery, Advanced jQuery, and then we build a really nice looking responsive to-do list project together. So that's a code along as well, and it's an entire unit, 7 or 8 videos there too. And then we have a big switch. So everything up until this point, excluding the first course basics unit, talks about front-end web development, which we talk about what that means and what the difference is, front-end and back-end, full stack, all that stuff in the next unit. But I'll just point out, this is all front-end. This is all back-end. So right here, there's a big line where things shift. So we move to back-end, and we start by talking about the very basics, just like we did up here for front-end. So what is the back-end? What are the different things that are involved? We talk about some diagrams, we draw some things out, and I show you some examples of sites and how the back-end is set up on some popular websites. And then we talk about the command line. How do you navigate through the command line or the terminal? What are the different commands you enter? Definitely the most hacker-looking thing that we cover. If you've ever seen like a stereotypical hacker scene in a movie, they're usually typing things into the command line. So we will be talking about that and using that for the rest of the course. Then we talk about Node.js, and this is an introduction to Node.js, and then an introduction to Express, which is a Node framework that we'll be using. Again, I know that's just a bunch of words, but it's a Node framework we'll be using to create our web applications, and we continue with those 2 things for the rest of the course. So then we talk about Intermediate Express, basically some more advanced topics, and then we get to something different, Yelp Camp Basics. And you'll notice there's a few different instances of Yelp Camp. Yelp Camp Basics, Yelp Camp Data Persistence, Yelp Camp Comments, Yelp Camp Adding Auth, and Yelp Camp Cleaning Up. And Yelp Camp definitely starts to sound weird after you repeat it enough times, but what it is is a complex application that we create together, and it's one that we keep revisiting. So rather than one-off small projects where it's really hard to get to something substantial with just one unit or just a few videos, this is a big project that we continually revisit. And don't worry, we have plenty of shorter, smaller projects. I'm a really strong believer that you should start by seeing a small instance of something working, making a small project, and then apply it to something big so that you get both ends of that spectrum. You're not just thrown into the deep end immediately, making a huge project, but you're also not stuck making these tiny toys for your entire course. I want you to have something that you can be proud of and something that is really, really complex by the end of the course. So Yelp Camp is a Yelp-like clone for campground, campsites, and outdoor activities. So you can create campgrounds, have photos, leave comments, all sorts of fun things, log in, authentication, we talk about authorization, and every time we learn a new feature, we go add it into Yelp Camp. So we start there, Yelp Camp Basics, that's the first time we see the app, and we set up the very basic structure. Then we talk about databases. We talk about MongoDB, which is the particular database that we'll use, and we make a small project there. And then we go back to Yelp Camp and add in MongoDB so that we now have a database connected to Yelp Camp. And then we talk about a really important topic called RESTful routing. This is an architecture, it's a way of planning our applications, a pattern that we follow called REST, and we build a nice looking blog app using RESTful routes and a new CSS and JavaScript framework called Semantic UI, which is similar to Bootstrap, which we learned earlier in the course, right here. And the idea there is just to expose you to another technology, another popular framework. Hopefully you start to see some of the similarities and draw some comparisons there. Then we move on to one of the more important units, database associations. So how do we have multiple things in our database that are connected, like users and comments, or blog posts and comments in tags and votes, and how are they all interrelated and connected to one another? And then we go back to Yelp Camp and we add in comments. So we'll learn about database associations in a smaller project, and then we add it in to Yelp Camp. Then we move on to authentication, user login, signing up, signing out, logging in, all of that using a tool called Passport.js. And we add that into our own application. We make an application with login, a smaller application, and then just like before, we go back to Yelp Camp and we add in authentication so that you now have to log in and log out to use Yelp Camp, or at least to use some features. And then we have another unit of Yelp Camp where at this point we've covered so much that we need to go back and clean some things up, refactor, which basically means move some code around, rewrite some code so that it's cleaner, shorter, more modular. So you'll see exactly what I mean in that unit, but it's devoted to reorganizing this large app because at that point it's gotten very large. And then we talk about authorization, which is another important topic, which is basically user permissions, different levels of things that users are allowed to do. So authentication is just letting people log in. Authorization is making sure that when I'm logged in, I can only delete photos that belong to me or edit comments that I created. I can't screw with somebody else's comments or someone else's posts unless I have permission to do that. So we talk about how that works, and we add it into Yelp Camp. There's definitely a lot of stuff that we cover, a lot of technologies, but the key point is that we go through this in a very logical and well thought out order. I've taught all of these technologies multiple times over to tons of different classes, different students. It's much less intimidating than it might seem. You don't have to be thinking ahead the entire time. But what I will do, rather than just going straight ahead and just doing one unit at a time, we do have certain lectures that are optional, these lessons that are looking ahead and looking back. So basically at certain points in the course, I'll take a moment to say, here's what we've covered, here's where we're going, so that you can start to have a mental map of where we are. Often I found that students get lost sometimes and they don't have a big picture vision in their head of where they are. They just put their head down and focus on what's immediately in front of them. So that is important, but it's also important to come up for air occasionally and talk about where we've come and how much further we have to go and basically draw that line. Okay, so there's a lot of really exciting material, lots of fun projects we get to. Let's go ahead and get started by talking about an introduction to front-end web development.